Right now, somewhere in your wallet or purse, there's a small card, or these days, just a number you've memorized, 9 digits long. Those 9 digits follow you from the moment you are born until long after you are dead. They determine whether you can get a job, open a bank account, file your taxes, collect a pension, or access almost any government service. Without those 9 digits, you essentially cannot function in modern Canada. And yet, for the first 97 years of this country's history, none of that existed. There was no social insurance number. There was no universal system for tracking a single Canadian from birth to death. So the question becomes, and it's one that most people have never really stopped to think about, how on earth did the Canadian government keep track of millions of people without it? The answer is both fascinating and, in places, deeply unsettling. Because for most of Canadian history, the government didn't really track you at all. Not in any systematic, centralized way. You were born, you lived, you died, and unless you owned land, paid certain taxes, immigrated through a federal port, or served in the military, there was a good chance the government had almost no record that you ever existed. Let me take you back to the beginning. When Confederation happened in 1867 and the British North America Act came into force, the founders embedded one requirement into the new constitution, a census, taken every 10 years. This wasn't done out of curiosity. It was done for one specific political purpose, to determine representation in the new parliament. The first national census under Confederation took place in 1871, counting the population of Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. It was an ambitious document for its time, 211 questions covering land, religion, education, and occupation. But it was still a snapshot. It told the government roughly how many people lived where on a single day in April. It did not follow those people afterward. If a man appeared on the 1871 census in Nova Scotia and moved to Manitoba by 1881, nothing connected those two records. He might as well have been two different people. And in a young, sparsely settled, highly mobile country, that happened constantly. So if the census wasn't tracking people in any ongoing way, what was? The answer, much like in most young nation-states, was a patchwork of local, provincial, and church records, most of them designed for purposes that had nothing to do with identifying citizens as such. Property and tax rolls were kept at the municipal or provincial level, and they only captured you if you owned land or a business. Vital records, births, marriages, deaths, were, for most of the 19th century, the job of churches, not the state. Ontario didn't make civil registration of births and deaths compulsory until 1869, and even then enforcement was weak for decades. A child born on a remote homestead in the prairies in the 1880s might have no documented record of their existence at all, no birth certificate, no baptismal record, nothing but a line in a family Bible. That is a genuinely strange thing for a modern person to sit with, an entire life, lived and ended, with the state never once officially acknowledging it happened. Immigration was the other major threat. Because Canada was, from Confederation onward, a country actively trying to fill its territory, it kept unusually detailed arrival records, ship manifests recording name, age, occupation, and destination, especially once immigration sheds and inspection stations like the one that would later become known through Pier 21 in Halifax came into use in the 20th century. But like the American Ellis Island records this mirrors, these were entry records, not ongoing surveillance. Once you cleared inspection, you were free, and there was no mechanism to follow you afterward. An arriving immigrant could give one name at the port and adopt another the moment they stepped off the train. Each system, census, tax rolls, church registries, immigration manifests, military muster rolls, existed in its own silo, run by different levels of government, with no common thread linking them together. That changed, slowly and then quickly, in the 20th century, driven by the same forces that reshaped identity systems everywhere, war, and the administrative state that war leaves behind. Canada introduced its first permanent federal income tax in 1917, under the Income War Tax Act, explicitly framed as a temporary wartime measure to help finance the First World War. It was supposed to be repealed once the war debts were paid off. It never was. But even this new tax system identified people by name and address, not by a unique number, with all the same headaches that caused when two men shared a name in the same city. The bigger turning point came with unemployment. The Unemployment Insurance Act of 1940 created Canada's first national unemployment insurance program, administered by the newly formed Unemployment Insurance Commission. Starting in 1942, the Commission began issuing numbered UIC cards to insured workers so it could track contributions and claims. It worked, for a while. But it was never designed to scale to the entire population, and by the early 1960s the system was running out of usable number combinations. At the same time, Ottawa was preparing to launch something far more ambitious, a national contributory pension plan. Old age support in Canada had already gone through one major transformation. The first old age pension, in 1927, was a means-tested, jointly funded, provincially administered program available only to British subjects aged 70 and over who had lived in Canada for 20 years, and it came with an application process many recipients found humiliating. In 1951, following a constitutional amendment, Parliament replaced it with the Old Age Security Act, which for the first time gave every Canadian over 70 a universal flat pension, regardless of income. It was a landmark of the post-war welfare state. But it still didn't require tracking a lifetime of individual earnings, because the benefit wasn't tied to what you'd paid in. That changed with the Canada Pension Plan. In 1962, the Royal Commission on Government Organisation, the Glasgow Commission, concluded that the federal government urgently needed a single, standardized personal identifier if it was going to administer modern, earnings-linked social programs efficiently. The old UIC numbering system was exhausted, computers were becoming central to government record-keeping, and Ottawa was about to launch the Canada Pension Plan, which, unlike old age security, would need to track every worker's contributions over an entire career. On 6 January 1964, the government of Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson announced it would assign every insured person a unique 9-digit number. Regulations authorizing the new system took effect that April, created not by a vote in Parliament but by order in Council, a detail that still surprises people when they learn it, since it means the single most consequential identifier in Canadian life was never actually debated and passed as its own standalone law. That number was the Social Insurance Number. Employers were required to make sure every employee, present and future, had one. The SIN was purely numeric, formatted as 3 groups of 3 digits, and the first digit indicated the province where it was issued. The digits 0 and 8 were never used. In 1965, the brand new Canada Pension Plan, and Quebec's parallel Quebec Pension Plan, adopted the SIN as their file number. In 1967, what was then Revenue Canada, today the Canada Revenue Agency, began using it for income tax reporting. And just like that, in the space of 3 years, a number invented to solve an unemployment insurance bookkeeping problem became the backbone of Canada's entire social benefit and tax infrastructure. It didn't stop there. Through the late 1960s and into the 1980s, the Canadian military used the SIN as a service identifier, stamping it onto ID cards and dog tags before reverting to separate service numbers in the 1980s. Banks began requiring SINs for any account earning interest, so they could report that interest to the CRA. Over subsequent decades, provinces folded SIN collection into driver's licensing and social assistance programs. What had begun as a narrow administrative tool for one commission's bookkeeping had, agency by agency, program by program, become something close to a de facto national identity number, in a country that, notably, has never passed a law formally designating it as one, and where Parliament has still never held a dedicated vote on its use. For decades, the physical evidence of this was a small paper or laminated card, mailed or issued in person once you applied. But the very qualities that made it convenient, a plain number with no photo, no biometric data, nothing to verify that the person holding it was actually the person it belonged to, also made it a magnet for fraud. Anyone who learned your 9 digits could, in effect, borrow your financial identity. By the early 2010s, the government had had enough of the card itself being treated as a piece of ID people carried around and handed to landlords, cable companies, and gym receptionists. In 2014, Service Canada stopped issuing the physical plastic SIM card altogether. Today, when you are assigned a number, you get a confirmation letter, in person, by mail, or digitally, not a wallet card, specifically to discourage people from treating it as identification. That fragility became painfully visible in 2019. Desjardins, the largest federation of credit unions in North America, disclosed that a rogue employee in its marketing department had, over roughly 26 months, quietly exfiltrated the personal data of what eventually turned out to be nearly all 4.2 million of its individual members plus business clients, close to 9.7 million people in total once every category was counted, including names, dates of birth, addresses, and social insurance numbers. It became the largest data breach in Canadian financial services history, led to a nearly $201 million class action settlement, and forced a national conversation Canada had never really had before. What do you do when the one number tying together your entire financial life leaks, and there's no realistic way to simply issue everyone a new one? Because that's really the core tension. The SIN was never designed to survive. It was built in 1964 to solve a narrow, specific bookkeeping problem for one pension plan and one insurance program, on the explicit understanding, much like its American cousin, the Social Security number, that it wouldn't be used for anything else. And yet, decade by decade, agency by agency, it became the master key to Canadian identity anyway, not through any single dramatic law, but through the same quiet bureaucratic logic every time. It's easier to reuse a number that already exists than to build a new system from scratch. Step back far enough, though, and there's a deeper question worth sitting with. For nearly a century after Confederation, Canada functioned. It counted its people, taxed them, settled its territory, fought 2 world wars, without ever assigning a single citizen a permanent tracking number. Your identity was your name, your parish or congregation, your neighbors, your local land registry. The teller at the bank knew you because they'd known your family for 20 years. That world didn't vanish because of some deliberate plan to build a surveillance state. It vanished because a modern industrial welfare state, one that pays pensions, collects income tax, and insures against unemployment for millions of people over entire lifetimes, simply cannot run on handshake and reputation. You cannot administer the Canada pension plan for millions of workers using a filing cabinet and good faith. Somewhere in that gap between the country Canada used to be and the one it became, a 9-digit number quietly filled the space no one had built a system for. So the next time you are asked for those 9 digits, on a job application, a bank form, a tax return, it's worth remembering that for most of this country's history, none of it existed. Your great-great-grandparents lived and died as names in a parish register, not numbers in a database. Whether that was better or worse is a fair question to sit with. But the Canada they lived in, where a number assigned by an unemployment insurance clerk in 1964 would one day follow you to the grave and beyond, would be almost unrecognizable to them.